Hello, everyone. It is Saturday, March 21st, and welcome to another, is it Saturday, March 21st? Yes, I'm right. Listen, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank continues to raise concerns about how stable our banking system really is. Is it vulnerable? Is it as well as established as it once were? Is it a respected financial institution? What has the fallout from this collapse? Has it been only limited to corporations? Has it affected small business owners? What about the startups? What about hard-working people who earn their money and place cash in the bank? What about the FDIC, who's proposing protecting both the insured and uninsured deposits will likely have little effect? Aside from insured deposits, depositors will only receive a portion of their uninsured funds, while the remainder will be paid off from the proceeds of the sales of Silicon Bank's assets. The collapse is breathtaking. It's a reminder that this institution is infallible and that measures must be taken to ensure its stability in the future. Why was the CEO able to take his funds out and sell stocks and shares and make millions? Why were top executives able to get paid and top employees while everyday people had to wait around? And is this another bailout for banks? Only when we can restore trust in this banking system and prevent future financial crises will we finally trust these institutions not to be like the Bernie Madoffs of the world or the Sam Bankman-Friedmans of the world, where we know what they engaged in was a Ponzi scheme. Are banks now Ponzi schemes? Are they there to do the will of the people? Welcome to this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. Tiffany Norwood is joining us. You know, I want to read something to you from the Bible, Ms. Norwood. It is Proverbs 19th chapter, 7th verse. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. Prayer for financial breakthrough, Lord. Thank you that you have entrusted me to manage and steward my finances with wisdom and diligence. Help me to grow in wisdom as I seek to honor you through my finances. What does that say to the everyday person? What does it say to the banks and these other financial institutions? What is this scripture trying to tell us?
You know, it's talking to us about being responsible and respectful of our finances and not to sort of play the games that we see being played in the financial industry with other people's money as well. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm self-made. I'm the American dream, and faith has been such a huge part of my journey. And I look to my tribe, my collaborators, God, and others when these types of things happen as an entrepreneur. And I also look to the environment that we've created as a country, where we are the country that's supposed to be about entrepreneurship and startups. And we've created this environment that makes us non-competitive with the rest of the world. And so I think it's important to discuss on a variety of different fronts, and also to keep in mind, I don't remember who said this, but he said it famously, banking is supposed to be boring. So also, how did we get to the place where banking has become this almost a spectator sport with all these incredibly complex and creative plays and instruments?
But how did banking become so corrupt?
I don't know if banking is exceptionally corrupt. I think, you know, when you live in a society that is based on capitalism, so many people are striving to win and to seize that ring. And the ring typically is defined by money. So I think there's like this huge level of ambition and competitiveness that sometimes goes awry. Many times goes awry in our country and around the world when people are dangling that carrot in front of you. I think it is important for there to be transparency and accountability, because typically when you shine a light on something or when someone else is observing it, it affects people's behaviors, including founders and investors, and I've been both.
So, but does this also say that that dingling object, that shining penny, that silver dollar, can it also causes the regulators to compromise themselves, to see what they don't want to see, fail to do due diligence in terms of what the bank deregulation should supposed to be about, to the point where people, innocent people, taxpayers, end up paying the ultimate cost for this greed, for this lack of monitoring, when you don't have someone in place assessing the management risk. You understand why that is so important, and not have someone in place for 7, 8 months, and your bank is bleeding cash and no one says anything, and your agenda is not climate change, LGBTQ issues. We understand there's a time and place for that, but you also must have solvency and some kind of control of your banking environment, which has been entrusted to you. Are we saying that the regulators have loosened those 4 pillars where people are now exploiting it at the expense of everyday people?
True. I think some of the stuff that's going on, say, for example, with ESG that you mentioned, didn't play into the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. What played into the collapse was, and you bring up a good point about the guardrails and regulations, and what about the regulators, and is everyone in on this, right? As a country, in our economic history, when I first started, say, on Wall Street, I used to work on Wall Street and in the banking industry in the late 80s and 90s during that banking collapse. And as a tech entrepreneur, my first software that I licensed was actually a little over 30 years ago, as part of the consolidation of the commercial banking industry back in the early 90s. So this isn't my first time at the rodeo. And interestingly enough, we go through these cycles as a country where we'll loosen and everyone goes a bit crazy, then something like this will happen, we'll tighten, then people get comfortable, we loosen, and then everything goes a bit crazy, and we go through a cycle. And I think it's important for us to make a commitment to where are our values with all of this, like how do we balance the desire to make money and the desire to look after the average person, the employees that are at all of these companies. What happened recently was during the Great Recession, which was so painful for small business owners like me, we had the I hate to use the term bailout, but basically they bailed out the banking industry back in 2010.
It was welfare.
Yeah.
This is not the form of welfare.
Possibly you could look at it that way, especially because it saved a lot of the investment banks. And the investment banks were supposed to be the banks that took risks, and you knew that you could lose everything. But when it came to losing everything, people were like, whoa, Houston, we have a problem. But after that, we had passed the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010. And in that Dodd-Frank Act, it created all these different measures for reporting and transparency and regulation, which a lot of people liked and a lot of people didn't like, for banks in our country that had over $50 billion in deposits. So theoretically, something like Silicon Valley Bank shouldn't have happened, right? But years later, in 2018, there was like this Economic Recovery Act. I forget the name of the act, but they loosened that act then loosened a lot of the regulations, and it basically required the more extensive reporting requirements for banks, the absolute largest banks in the country. So banks that had $250 billion of deposits or more. There are only 12 banks in the country that have that much under deposit. So all the rest of the banks could not do anything they wanted to do, but they could do a lot of things that they wanted to do that they wouldn't have been able to do if they were more heavily regulated. Hence, Silicon Valley Bank, hence Signature Bank. They were no longer being deeply observed by the Fed, and so they start to play certain games. In Silicon Valley's bank, it was the game of taking this flood of extra deposits coming off the pandemic and placing them in treasuries. and then treasuries start to tank because of the interest rate hikes, and there was nowhere for them to get capital, which then caused a run on the bank by the venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs and the employees. Silicon Valley Bank is such a unique, and some of those other banks that focus on the tech industry are such unique banks. They're sort of similar to some of the farmers banks that were out there back in the day, where it's so caught up in a singular industry that if it goes down, it can bring down an entire industry. So let me tell you what I mean by that.
Hold that. And again, thank you for joining us. We're going to bring in our other guests. This is a very important conversation for people to have, because people are nervous. There's uncertainty.
Yeah.
They're vulnerable, and they're scared.
And I understand that, and it's an important conversation to have.
And we will have it when we return. And welcome back with our guest, Tiffany Norwood.
Norwood, yes.
Yes, Norwood.
Although I have a hard head, and it's maybe made of wood, so you're not far off.
I see there is Goodman.
Hi.
And there's Joe. No, well, I see somebody. You were, before we went out the break, you said, let me explain. Please continue that.
Yeah, I wanted to give, I'm a serial entrepreneur, so I've been in the tech industry for 30 plus years. I've done 9 startups, and last year I was even named Entrepreneur of the Year for Cornell University. And more importantly, I was a customer of Silicon Valley Bank when they first expanded across the states to the DC area back in the late 90s. I was doing a startup called Next Generation Broadband, and we put our money and had all of our banking relationships with Silicon Valley Bank starting in 2001. Corporate accounts, line of credits, other banking products. So I want to fully disclose there. I also want to fully disclose that I am not a customer right now and haven't been for the past few years. Not because of them, I love them, but just for strategic reasons for something else. So I have this deep experience in the industry and even with SVB, but yet I can, I'm sort of centered enough to speak from an external perspective because I'm not stressing out myself right now. So the unique perspective I wanted to give with Silicon Valley Bank is that they were deeply, deeply plugged into our industry in a unique way that other banks wouldn't be. And what it looked like was the venture capitalists held their fund accounts there. The venture capitalists as individuals banked there. The founders banked there. The corporate accounts were there. The employees had their money there. So you had this whole industry and all the stakeholders and the components at this one bank. You may be like, well, why? Because Silicon Valley Bank, and this is so odd, right, was part of the identity of the tech industry. So as soon as you banked at that bank, you became an insider, you got introduced to people, business development, et cetera. So this is how it happened. So when something happens with Silicon Valley Bank and a venture capitalist starts to pull all their fund money out and tells their portfolio company founders to pull their fund money out, you can see very quickly how there can be a run on the bank in modern times, which, a run is no longer physically running to the bank, but doing some clicks on a keyboard, which makes it even easier to run on the bank because you don't have to go outside in the cold. And secondly, unlike most other leaders and small business owners, you're having pressure put on you by this external factor to do certain things, i.e. that your funders and investors, even if you decide not to. And then all of your employees are also at this bank. I was speaking to one of my contacts in the industry, Dick Parsons, who, among many other things, is the former chairman of Citibank. And he was saying, and he banked at Silicon Valley Bank too, he was saying that he had various founders in his investment portfolio calling him over the weekend asking for money to make payroll this week. Not in the future, but now. And so you can imagine how very quickly that would have brought down the whole industry. And most of the founders, most of the employees in the industry, we're not Elon Musk. That would be like saying all singers are as successful as a Lady Gaga, right? Most employees are living paycheck to paycheck, just like any other American. Most Americans now are tech adjacent because it's technology is 10% of our GDP, whereas when the tech bubble burst in 2000, it was only 4%. So we all have it in our retirement accounts, in our regular investment accounts. We have friends and family that work in the industry, and many of us work in the industry. So I think it was important for the federal government to step in because we need to shore up our economy right now as we and the rest of the world are recovering from the devastating impact of the pandemic. I don't think this is the time that we want an industry to implode that's 10% of our GDP. With that said, I'm glad that the federal government focused on the depositors versus the shareholders. I think it was important for the depositors to be made whole.
Let me go to Joel Griffith. And this is Joel, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. But what the government said to us is to depositors, they took us from depositors to the fact that you're going to take your money and put it into the bank. And what your deposit is going to become is no longer a deposit, but a loan to the bank and these sharks to go out and take as many risks with the money that we're guaranteeing the loan on as you want. Whether you lose it or not, we're going to bail you out. That is the message from the government.
Yeah, make no mistake. This is an enormous bailout to those depositors. These depositors were venture capital firms, private equity firms. These were sophisticated investors. And they're not mentioning to us what kind of interest rates they were getting on their checking and savings accounts. You know what interest rates Silicon Valley Bank was paying to those depositors? They were earning in excess of 5% per year. Now, think about you. If you've got a Wells Fargo or Chase account, I bet you're not getting anywhere close to 5%. You're probably getting about 0.3%. So these are sophisticated investors. They put their deposits on hand at SVB Bank. They were getting juiced up deposit returns, and that's because SVB was making risky investments with those deposits. And now all of us are being forced to bail out those venture capital firms. All over the weekend, we heard them fanning these flames of hysteria, saying that if we didn't make their deposits 100% whole, we would have a run on the banks nationwide and we'd have people out of work. That is a flat out lie. These depositors would have had to take maybe a 10 or 15% loss, but that is normal. This happens almost each and every month across this country in banks that fail. That's part of the risk. But because these folks were well connected, because they're politically savvy, they were able to arrange a bailout that all of us are going to have to pay for. This is immoral. It is wrong, and it should not have been allowed to happen.
Before I go to Jordan, I want to come back to you, because I know you don't disagree with him. Totally, you don't. But what we're saying here, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and other big banks are definitely too big to fail. They cannot fail because our economy would collapse. But other banks are not too big to fail.
I think the definition of big has changed tremendously, right?
Who gets to change the definition?
Our government and
Our
legislators
government. There you go.
So they've been changing it. So when we, when we raised the definition of big from 50 billion in 2010 to 250 billion in 2018, basically what we were saying is if a bank is below 250 billion, it's small, we don't need to pay attention to it. But what we're learning from Silicon Bank and from Signature Bank is that they're big enough to have a tremendous impact on our economy. So in reality, I think we should drop the threshold back to 50 billion and keep an eye on these banks that are 50 billion and above. And it's not that many banks. There's 12 banks above 250 billion in deposits, and there's about 46 banks, I want to say, above 50 billion in deposit. If the federal government can't keep an eye on 46 of anything, then we have other things that we should be talking about.
Here's my question to you, Jordan. What has the people who run these banks, the top executives, what do they learn about accountability and responsibility if the government steps in and bails them out and there are no consequences for what I consider to be corruption?
Well, there were some consequences, which is that they lost their jobs and their stock went to zero. Now, in the case of Silicon Valley, a lot of the executives sold their stock when it was still high, so they're not hurt that much. But, they've lost their jobs, their company's gone out of existence, and they're very embarrassed by it. So there are some consequences. But you're basically right.
But no one's going to jail.
They're not going to go to jail, probably right, because they're not going to get them on insider trading things. I agree with you. But I mean, you're right. If the bank is going to get taken over by the government, then they take risks. This is you socialize the losses, and the profits go to a small number of people. So I would agree that they made the wrong lesson here. And what they did is they took a lot of risk by buying long-term treasury bonds, which fell in value, and by making loans to high-tech companies based on new issues that might go in the future. But, I mean, Silicon Valley took a lot of risks, and now they're paying the price for it.
So, Joe, what should the government do that it has not done before? Because Tiffany talked about the banking crisis in the 80s. She was there firsthand to experience that because she was once in the industry. Now we witnessed the housing crisis, very similar. Now we have another banking crisis. These things continue. Why is it that we're not learning and the firewalls that we need to put in place?
Well, we're not learning because there's too many people benefiting from this. Of course, you've got these depositors, the wealthy, that put their money in here. They're able to get their 5% annual interest rates and then get bailed out when the bank went under, so they win. But think about who else wins here. We have a situation in which banks have been allowed to consider these treasury bonds as risk-free assets when it turns out they are quite risky. We've seen these treasury bonds decline in value by 20% over the past year and a half. Well, who stood to benefit from these banks being able to classify treasury bonds as risk-free investments? The politicians in Washington, D.C. benefited from that because these banks became a ready buyer of all of this government debt. And when you had all of these banks buying up that government debt, guess what? That created artificial demand for that debt, which kept interest rates on the government debt lower. So politicians gained as well. Our entire system has been nearly brought down because of our central bank working hand in hand with Republicans and Democrats in Congress to finance crazy government spending. I mean, think about the deficit we have, $350,000 per family of four. It's obscene. We've had our central bank working hand in hand with Congress. This has created the problem, including the most recent banking crisis.
This is the Armstrong Williams Show, and we will be back.
Yeah, because
And welcome back to the broadcast with Jordan Goodman. Joel is joining us, Griffith, and Tiffany Norwood. During the break, we were brief discussion. What needs to happen? You talked about the founders. You talked about 250,000 being insured. It's not a whole lot. Mm-hmm. Small business owners.
Yeah, I mean, I think now it's, what do we do now for the future? I'm not going to get into all the politics and the government regulations, et cetera, because I'm a tech founder, right? I'm not a politician. But what I will say is that there are two paths to sort of prevent these types of things for the future, or at least make them less likely in impacting small businesses and the employees. And those two paths are a path of the Fed and a path of the founder. With the path of the Fed, I think that they really need to look at this deposit insurance. If we look at deposit insurance of $250K, yeah, that's great for an individual, but for a small business, and I'm not talking about the big companies, for a small business, $250K can maybe cover payroll for a 25-person company for 1 month. That's it. So if you're looking at your bank having issues and you're a small business owner, and you are dealing with you're saying, oh, I can only have 250,000 of my deposits back, you're going to immediately run on the bank, because 1 month is of covering payroll, let alone you still have to pay rent and medical premiums and all these other payroll taxes. On top of that, you look at that and all you can do is panic, because it's not going to be helpful. The Fed needs to have a separate level for small businesses. We are the American dream. It should be at least $1 million under deposit in modern times, right, for a small business. And I think that will help some of the smaller players during a run on the bank. I'm not saying change it for the individuals. So that then when you're looking at a situation like a Silicon Valley Bank, the government and others might feel more comfortable that the smaller players are going to be protected, that people aren't going to be getting calls from other founders saying, I can't make payroll on Friday. The second thing is on the founder side, and we're super busy when we're doing startups for like 3+ years. We're getting no sleep. We're spending our savings to work 20 hours a day. Many times I'll have a pillow and a blanket under my desk, and I live 5 minutes from my office. It's that much work. So we're not looking at complicated, money management strategies to protect our money. We're just trying to make sure to keep our company in business. With that said, founders should have 3 different accounts at least 3 different banks. Their personal account should be at a different bank. Their operating account, which is their externally facing account that just has 1 or 2 months of OPEX in it, should be at one bank. And then their reserve account, where they sweep all the other money in for reserves for the rainy day and or expenses that don't happen monthly but are more occasional, should be at a third bank, and that should be your reserve account. That will help as well. And then if they're even bigger as a small business, so say they're doing a couple of $1 million of revenue a year, they should also look at cash management and speak to their bank about that, which are basically accounts that are part of a network of banks where automatically funds are swept between those accounts to make sure that any one account only has $250,000 in it, so that everything's insured. And then a bonus, there is private insurance for bank accounts. So if you feel you're really at risk or in a risky industry, go get insurance beyond FDIC.
So Joe, what do you say to someone now who has come to the realization, I am financially ruined?
Well, look, if you were a shareholder in SBNY or in Silicon Valley Bank, and those were your only investments, then you are financially ruined. I think this underscores the importance of diversification. If you're saving for retirement or otherwise, you should not have all of your assets parked in one company. I think this underscores that. If you're an investor and you had 5% of your portfolio in Silicon Valley Bank and 95% elsewhere, you can recover from that loss. I think that's important. But the solution here to preventing this is not to increase the federal insurance caps on these deposits. As my fellow guest just mentioned, you can buy private insurance if need be. The solution is not to force Main Street America to backstop these wealthy venture capitalists and private equity firms. Let's not lose sight of the big picture here. These private equity firms were receiving 5% annual interest rates off of these deposits, and now we have made them completely whole. And it's an absolute misnomer to think that if this bank would have gone belly up, that those depositors would have lost all of their investments. They would have not. They would have received the $250,000 plus. They would have received their deposits back proportional to what the bank sold off their assets for. And they would have been able to sell off those government bonds likely around 80 cents on the dollar. None of those depositors would have had all of their deposits wiped out. What they would have had to do is raise money from their investors to cover some of these losses. This happens each and every day in the business world. To force middle-class American families and business owners to cover their losses is deeply immoral, is highly unnecessary.
Can I just add something to that? I just want to say to Joel and others that as far as I understand it, the taxpayers are not bailing out Silicon Valley Bank. As far as I understand it from my connections in the industry, the banks pay deposit insurance, and from that pool of deposit insurance, the federal government is making whole the depositors. Again, the shareholders are screwed, but the depositors are being made whole from this pool of money that banks pay into, insurance pool they pay into, not coming from Main Street.
Well, with all due respect, when we say the depositors are being made whole, that is a bailout. These are hundreds of the wealthiest venture capitalists, the wealthiest private equity firms. When we say made whole, that means every single dollar that they had on hand at that bank, we the taxpayers are going to pay for it. And most people don't realize when you have your $10,000 checking account, you're paying, in effect, as a fee each and every month as insurance on your deposits. What we're doing now is we're going to be draining the FDIC accounts to go ahead and funnel this to those millionaires and billionaires. And ultimately, we, the middle class people in this country and the business owners, are going to have to replenish those accounts. It is a bailout.
In all fairness, though, there are also everyday people banking at
SVB, yeah. Most founders are everyday people. I mean, everyone sees people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, but the majority of founders are people just trying to make a difference in the world through their startups and their companies and look after their employees and make a living. I believe the average founder gets paid about $100-something thousand a year in salary, but in the first few years, we don't pay ourselves at all.
Jordan Goodman, what is the elephant in the room?
The elephant in the room is that the banking system's in trouble. They had to bail us out and have wide insurance for everybody, including uninsured deposits, overnight. They did not plan for this at all. This is what they call a black swan event. So we have a black swan and an elephant in the room at the same time, I guess you'd say.
You know, one of the things we've not mentioned here, Tiffany, is greed. There are people who get up in the morning, just like when Silicon Valley Bank, it was set up to attract the tech giants, the startups. They saw it as a business. Like how you say you bust your chops, get very little sleep. They saw it as an opportunity. But in terms of due diligence and staying on top of what was going on in the bank, it just did not happen. They became too comfortable. I'm not saying they hired the wrong people out of this forced diversity to celebrate different cultures. Do they always have the best people to run and manage? Because listen, $200 billion is a lot of money, okay? And you're right about something else. As a small business owner, $250,000 insured, it's not even a pebble on the ocean. I mean, it's just not. So you're absolutely correct there. But what about the people that manage and run these? And I know we talked about the regulators, but there's only so much regulators can do. In the end, it's the people that are there day-to-day to run these operations.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And I've been a leader nearly my entire life. I was first a CEO at 19. I was in the banking industry starting as a teenager too, working in sales and trading and mergers and acquisitions. So I get it. You're right. There is an aspect of personal responsibility that we have let go of in our country at every level, in tech and politics and schools,
education,
yeah, and everywhere. And I think that's a bigger problem, not just something to be discussed specifically for this. Like, no one wants to be accountable for anything. No one wants to be competitive. A lot of times people take away the competitiveness through, say, lobbying or other shenanigans. As a small business owner, we are very aware that it's not the person who has the best product or tech or service that wins. Connections definitely matter to an extensive degree. So even the concept that we are this meritocracy as a country now, I think, is misplaced. Diversity, though, has nothing to do with it. I can say as a Black woman being in these spaces that I've had the reverse experience where I have been exceptional with regards to my experience, my talent, the money that I've made for people. I raised $700 million in my 20s to be part of the startup for World Space XM Radio. And so from that money that I raised, we built satellites. I worked with Nelson Mandela to help him, as well as a variety of other things. And all through that journey, I was treated in a very abusive way, and I sort of dealt with it. Right? I think part of it is that, and I've watched. Well, this isn't the topic of this particular show.
No, go ahead. No, please continue. You watched.
I have watched, over time, things start to change a bit. And having, been in Wall Street and been in tech and been in, I'm 54 countries, all my startups have been global. I have been immersed in cancel culture, but in the reverse, like people constantly trying to cancel me for when I step in the room, even sometimes just because of my hairstyle or whatever. And so I get that energy, but I also get that if we're going to get to a place in our country where everyone has, the equal opportunity to do whatever they want to do without being abused, and my journey was full of abuse. But because it was more of a spiritual journey than a professional journey, I took it on the chin because I thought, oh, well, Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. Who am I to complain about 20 years of sort of tough work, right? But I do take issue when people act as though diversity itself is a problem, because I think diversity is how we win. And it didn't bring down Silicon Valley Bank, and it won't bring down the United States in other sectors of the United States either. We do, though, need to move back to a meritocracy. And I think those two things are different. I'm sure Joel has something to say about that.
Joel, quickly, she called your name. Tiffany, go ahead, Joel.
Well, I think when we talk about the problems with the Silicon Valley Bank and also SBNY, the issue really comes down to their woke policies, particularly in terms of how they were investing. I poured through the social impact report from SBNY yesterday, and they very clearly said that they would not make loans and investments in companies that they deemed to be a negative on society. And the companies that they classified as negative on society were prisons that are actually keeping us safer. They refuse to make investments in armaments manufacturers that actually help us defend our country. And SBNY in particular said they would not fund fossil fuel companies. And of course, that fossil fuel companies give us abundant, affordable fuel sources. SVB Bank had very similar problems where they were engaged in woke policies trying to move us away from fossil fuel emissions, from carbon emissions. They were giving billions of dollars worth of investment money away. And in fact, SVB was funding more than half of the solar industry. So this is where it gets really perverse. A lot of their depositors that we bailed out were already on the government dole. These are companies that were making millions from tax credits and tax subsidies. They got bailed in on the front end, and then they got bailed out on the back end. This is very morally perverse.
And this is the Armstrong Williams Show. Just a stirring conversation today. And we'll be back to talk about how do you empower the poor and the less fortunate? What is the real blueprint? We'll be back. If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. When we talk about how do we help the less fortunate, and you got to also think about this, there are people who making $100,000 and plus a year, and they're still having problems making ends meet, and they're moving back home. Do we need to rethink the educational system and education in this country, Tiffany?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm rethinking it. I don't think we have to wait for others to do things. I think there's human potential from cradle to grave, and any way that we can do things to help rethink, how our kids are educated is important. Currently, I have 3 tech companies, and one of them actually is an ed tech company called Tribetan, and I specifically had started that for the reasons that you're talking about, where I was looking at our education system and thinking, wow, for being a self-made entrepreneur and having all this cultivating all this agency and being self-determined, there was a big hole of mindsets and skill sets that school never addressed for me. I had to learn and teach myself, that I think is important for the future. And these mindsets and skill sets are the mindsets and skill sets of entrepreneurs and innovators, who are the people in society that are self-made, that can take ideas and bring them into reality in the form of products and companies. And so I think it's important to start teaching everyone in society those skills so that they feel that they have more agency over their lives.
What are those skills?
They're skills like persuasive storytelling, for example. So, we learn creative writing. We might learn journalism. That creative is more for entertaining. Journalism's more for delivering information, right? Whereas persuasive storytelling is using words and narrative to create outcomes. So very similar to this type of storytelling founders do to raise money, to get new customers, to do deals. That is a teachable skill. And I've been teaching high school students, college students, as well as professionals that skill through our framework and curriculum. There's skills around handling uncertainty. There's skills around how do you cultivate endurance, because most things that are worth it take years to get done. Not everything has to be done tomorrow and instantly. If you want deep and long-lasting success, you're probably going to have to commit years to it. So how do you cultivate that endurance? How do you handle uncertainty? How do you collaborate effectively? Because most big things, I said I was part of the satellite radio startup, so we raised $700 million. By the time we got to the point of closing on that money, we were about 20 people. Within 18 months, we were 400 people around the world, right? So how do you cultivate collaboration to build and launch satellites to cover every country on Earth, right? And how do you do that effectively? Everyone, I think, needs to learn these whole portfolio of skill sets and mindsets for the future, because many other things are being replaced by automation, and that can be very scary if you don't feel that you have the resources or the ability to pivot and do other things. How do you pivot? We have to pivot all the time, right? And what does that look like?
Joel, how do we empower the poor and the underclass and those who make the 6 figures but still find themselves struggling? I think what Tiffany Norwood just shared absolutely was just brilliant. I mean, I never even had anyone to give it in such a way that she did, but what she said is absolutely necessary for success.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have to get back to the basics, especially for those that are at the bottom of the economic ladder. And one of the ways to do that is through education reform. If you look at what's been going on in states like Arizona and Florida, they're expanding education choice to middle-class families to allow them to escape public schools. That it's not just that the public schools aren't teaching STEM. The public schools are not teaching children how to read, how to be literate. Now, you look at Washington, D.C., for instance, close to a quarter of the graduates are functionally illiterate. So the schools need to get back to the basics of teaching how to read, teaching basic math, teaching the joy of learning. This is not being done in many of our public schools. We have to give them an escape route. And then two other ways in which we can actually empower people to make more of their lives. We still have a lot of occupational licensing that blocks people from getting into careers and things like in the floral industry, for instance, or nail care, basic industries where it's so hard for somebody who doesn't have financial means to expect them to take 3 or 4 months of full-time learning when they could be learning on the job. That does nothing to actually help them succeed. And lastly, we have to stop this war at the behest of organized labor, this war against independent contractors. This war is occurring in states like California, but it's also occurring on the federal level through the proposed PRO Act, which would make it very difficult for people to work as independent contractors. And look, being an independent contractor is one of the best ways for somebody of modest means to get ahead. My own family has done this. I did this when I was younger. We need to enable people to actually build their own businesses.
Jordan?
There's about 10.8 million jobs available in this country, and people don't have the skills to take the jobs that exist. Employers are desperate to hire workers, and they can't find the workers that got the skills. So you're talking about the educational system. We need people to learn the skills that employers need. There's currently about 5 million unemployed people and 10.8 million unfilled jobs. So that's that match that would help people. And it may not be glamorous things, maybe working with your hands. Every day, many, many baby boomers who are now hitting their 60s and 70s are retiring, and younger people are either not willing or able, don't have the skills to take the jobs those baby boomers are leaving. That's where you could really empower kind of the lower level of society, because they can get some really nice paying jobs if they have the skills to do it.
You know, Tiffany, you're Harvard and Cornell educated.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you're unique because you celebrate the fact that you're a woman and happen to be black. But that's just a fraction of the story for success. When you've gone through the school of hard knocks as you have, and you've had to go up against the old boys network, through that school of hard knocks, and what you've learned, basic, the narrative that the media puts out, why people succeed and why others fail, what are the real ingredients that separate the ordinary from that little extra, which is the extraordinary?
Yeah, so first off, thank you. I actually think of myself as ordinary, and I think of myself as a servant leader. And I'm constantly trying to stay in that middle line, because if I get too caught up when I have success moments and milestones, then I also have to get caught up when I have the failures. And if you're shooting high, you also go low and high and low. But I think some of the most important mindsets and skill sets beyond the ones that I shared with you is a sense of the we. So, you know, always recognizing that you're not in it alone. You can ask for help from others, not letting your ego get caught up when shit hits the fan, like, bleep. When stuff hits the fan like an SVB, do you pick up the phone or do you pick up a bottle of scotch? You know what I mean? The people that have been pushed to set ego aside, focus on winning in the goal, and pick up the phone and ask someone for help in making payroll are also more likely to succeed. I always feel like everyone has the ability to be successful. Some of the differences from someone like me versus, say, others that might not have gone down this path is that, you know, for me, I was willing to no matter how bad things got, because it's easy to operate in goodness, if you know what I mean. But it's like, how do you operate when things are really, really dark and really, really bad? And it could be economic, or it could be when my dad had died, or when my best friend died in September 11th. I was midstream in a startup, so I was both trying to find her, then plan a funeral, tell her parents. You know, I was the one that made that call, while also building out, at the time, broadband internet tech that was behind those self-install kits. And I couldn't stop because I had a few $100,000 of my own money at stake. How do you practice the mindset of, no matter how bad things get, I will show up the next day? How do you practice the mindset of, my ideas matter, I will speak up and share them, right? The way that you do that is you start now, wherever you are. I believe in what I call the law of transference. So say if you're a student, right, you're young, you're in school, you start speaking up in class. Be the person that raises your hand. Be the person that expresses your opinion, even if other people attack it. Start practicing there, because you can transfer it to higher stakes situations in the future. If something is hard, if you were working on a project, it could be a personal project, and all of a sudden the glass jar broke and the so-and-so thing didn't come on time, et cetera, et cetera. Practicing no matter what, no matter if it takes you an extra 2 months to do that project, finishing it. Is that mindset of going through the woods to finish it for something like a small project can be transferred to something bigger. And I'll give one other example.
20 seconds.
20 seconds. My first company was when I was 19, a backpack company. The first one-strap backpack, got the patent for that. We raised $5,000 to do that company. The next company was the satellite radio startup and raised $670 million. Literally, that experience of raising money as a teenager, I could apply to satellite radio.
And I want to thank you for joining us along with Joel and Jordan. Very wonderful and insightful conversations today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. On behalf of all of us here, I'm Armstrong Williams.
Thank you. Great conversation.
Excellent. I'm going to have you back.